On a national stage built for laughs, one woman turned satire into a battlefield. Jasmine Crockett walked into Stephen Colbert's arena, surrounded by 400 hostile audience members, as he tried to reduce her to a punchline, painting her as just another angry voice to amuse the crowd. But within minutes, she shattered the illusion, dropping irrefutable data, invoking raw, real-world tragedy, and delivering a single line that turned applause into paralyzed silence. When mockery is used to bury the truth, what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The camera swept across the studio, capturing every blinding spotlight and polished surface of the late show stage. It looked more like a battlefield than a comedy set tonight. Rows of sharply dressed liberal-leaning audience members leaned forward in their seats, buzzing with the smug anticipation of a ritual they'd seen before. A conservative walking into the lion's den, about to be shredded by Stephen Colbert's wit. The orchestra played a jazzy flourish as the announcer's voice boomed, "Please welcome Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." The applause was scattered, hesitant. Some clapped out of politeness, others crossed their arms. And though no one booed, the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Jasmine emerged from behind the curtain, wearing a sleek midnight blue blazer that caught the light like armor. Her heels clicked with deliberate force as she crossed the stage, chin high, flanked by invisible tension. The spotlight hit her like a sniper's scope, but she didn't blink. Colbert stood, arms open like a showman playing a trap door, and gestured toward her seat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice dripping with irony, "we are honored tonight to be joined by a congresswoman who's made headlines, not for legislation, but for interrupting more hearings than she's passed bills." The audience exploded with laughter. Laughter with teeth, the kind that doesn't laugh with you. It laughs at you. Jasmine walked to her chair without so much as a glance toward the crowd, not a flicker of discomfort. She had heard worse in silence, in back rooms, in hearings where her microphone was cut off mid-sentence. As she sat down, she met Colbert's gaze with the stillness of someone who had already seen the punch coming before he threw it. She didn't react to the applause or the insult. She reacted to the power dynamics. She wasn't here for permission to speak. She was here to break the script. The laughter from the crowd hadn't fully faded when Colbert reached for his next weapon. Words dressed as jokes, polished like glass shards. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His power wasn't volume. It was precision. He shifted in his chair, cocked his head slightly, and let his voice curl like smoke. "Congresswoman," he said in the tone of someone about to offer a compliment he had no intention of meaning, "help me out here. You say you represent working-class Americans. You talk about justice reform and institutional bias and systemic inequality. Big words, big claims. But let's be honest for a second." He smiled with the full confidence of someone who knew the crowd was already on his side. "When you're out there calling the entire system broken, do you think you're helping people understand? Or just helping them stay angry?" A few claps, some snickering. Then with the timing of a seasoned performer, he drove the blade. "Because some folks out there might hear you and wonder if you're speaking for them, or for the people who still think the earth is flat." The studio cracked open with laughter, short, sharp, and collective. It was the kind of laugh that didn't need context, and it only needed one thing: a target. Jasmine didn't move, not a twitch, not a blink. Her hands remained folded loosely in her lap, her back straight, posture dignified. But her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. The kind of silence that grew up knowing that if you showed even a flicker of offense, they'd claim you were too emotional. So she didn't react. She studied. Colbert kept going, emboldened. "Look, I get it. The justice system needs improvement. But there's a difference between reform and rebellion, right? You talk about tearing down structures, but what exactly are you building in their place?" He turned to the audience theatrically. "I mean, I like bridges, not bonfires." More laughter, applause. Jasmine slowly turned her head toward him. Her eyes were quiet, not cold, not angry, just focused in a way that made the air feel suddenly thinner. She waited a second longer than comfortable. Then she inhaled slowly through her nose and finally spoke, her voice calm as granite. "You're very good at that, Stephen." He raised an eyebrow. "At what?" "At turning real pain into punchlines." The studio didn't laugh. It didn't need to. Her words didn't ask for that. She continued, "And you're not the first. You're part of a long tradition of hosts, writers, commentators who treat lived experiences like raw material, cut, shaped, and fitted for a segment." She leaned slightly forward, but her voice never rose. "But I didn't come here to play supporting actress in a satire about my own reality." A ripple moved through the audience, something between discomfort and awe. Colbert opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For once, he wasn't sure if the next line would land or implode. Jasmine let the silence sit. She let it breathe. "You ask if I'm helping people understand or stay angry?" she said, voice edged with steel now. "Stephen, when someone's house is on fire, they don't need understanding. They need someone to admit there's a fire." She didn't blink as she said it. She didn't stammer. Every syllable landed like a footstep across a landmine field someone else had laid. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was surgical. "You brought me on your show," she continued, "and the first question you throw is if I speak for flat earthers." Her voice dropped just slightly. "You could have asked about sentencing disparity. You could have asked about communities that have 0 public defenders and 30 prosecutors. You could have asked about how zip codes still determine life expectancy. But no, you chose flat earth." Now it was Colbert who froze. Not theatrically, but genuinely. It was a brief, flickering beat where the rhythm of his show, so practiced, so reliable, missed a step. The cards in his hand suddenly seemed too flimsy to hold. Jasmine turned briefly to the audience, her eyes moving from face to face with something just short of confrontation. "You laughed. That's fine. I expected that. But I wonder, when's the last time anyone laughed with you when it was your reality being mocked?" No one moved. She returned her gaze to Colbert. "You ask what I'm building in place of the broken system," she said. "I'm trying to build a country where my niece doesn't have to memorize how to behave in front of a badge, where a mother doesn't have to outlive her son by 20 years because the trauma of growing up black in America aged his heart faster than his body." Now the air was dry, still. Even the camera operators were holding their breath, unsure whether to zoom or stay wide. The control room hesitated to cut to commercial, worried it might look like censorship. Colbert smiled thinly, nervously. "Well," he said, "you're certainly not pulling any punches." Jasmine nodded. "I didn't come here to spar. I came here to speak. If that feels like a punch, maybe it's time to ask why." It was the kind of moment television doesn't prepare for, because it can't be rehearsed. There was no applause sign blinking above the audience's heads now. There was only silence. Raw, ragged, real. Colbert glanced down at his notes. They looked different now, smaller, less clever. Jasmine sat back, still calm, still unshaken. Her voice had not once broken, but everything else in the room had. The studio hadn't yet exhaled from Jasmine's last answer, when Colbert adjusted in his seat with the faintest hint of unease. He tapped the edge of his cue cards against his knee, glanced toward the camera, then pivoted his body toward her with rehearsed casualness. But the shift in tone was unmistakable, cooler, controlled. His words came now with a calculated rhythm, not the flamboyant mockery of before, but something more deliberate. "Let's take it a little deeper, Congresswoman," he said, his voice calm but laced with condescension. "You've said publicly that America's healthcare system is racially biased. You've claimed the legal system, judges, prosecutors, even first responders, treat people differently based on their skin color." His eyebrows lifted as he spoke, feigning curiosity. "I mean, do you really believe that? That the system is so broken it sees you as less human before you've even said a word?" The audience stirred. A few shifted in their seats. The tone of this question wasn't built for laughter. It was bait for contradiction, and it was sharp. He smiled thinly, then pressed again. "I'm just asking, because when you say things like that, some people hear it and think you're accusing the entire medical and legal profession of being racist. That's a heavy charge. Are you really standing by it?" The lights above snapped brighter, subtly but deliberately, a visual cue the control room didn't announce out loud, but the effect was surgical. The glow pulled over Jasmine like an interrogation lamp. It framed her, boxed her in. One woman, surrounded by a machine that didn't need to shout to assert power, it just turned up the heat and waited for her to sweat. The camera zoomed, not fast but slow enough to feel invasive. Her face was now the only story on screen. She didn't flinch. But something behind her eyes shifted. Some quiet gate opening inward. She looked at Colbert, then slowly, methodically, turned her head to face the audience. Her hands were still folded neatly in her lap, but her presence had changed. It wasn't just composure anymore. It was lived weight, cold and ancient and personal. Her voice, when it came, wasn't angry. It was something deeper, wounded but not weak. "You want to know if I believe the system is rigged?" she said, eyes scanning the crowd. "I don't believe it, I know it." The audience didn't breathe, not audibly. "I know it because I once walked into an ER in Dallas with stabbing chest pain, difficulty breathing, and pressure that felt like an elephant sitting on my ribs." She paused. "The nurse looked at me, didn't run labs, didn't order scans, and told me it was anxiety. She said, 'Try to relax, you'll feel better in the morning.'" Her jaw tightened. The lighting caught the faintest shimmer in her eyes, not from tears, but from holding them back. "I wasn't anxious," she continued. "I had a partially collapsed lung. The lower left lobe was closing in on itself, and my oxygen was dropping. 2 more days like that, and I might not be sitting here." Colbert didn't speak. The audience was locked in. "They didn't miss it because they were bad people," she added, now turning back to face him. "They missed it because I didn't fit the default patient in their training manual. Because when Black women say they're in pain, we're seen as exaggerating, or dramatic, or angry." Her voice sharpened, but never rose. "I've been called all three, not in private. In clinical notes?" A few gasps flickered through the audience like wind across dry leaves. Colbert's smile had vanished. He leaned back slightly, not in defense, but in realization. This wasn't punditry. This was testimony. "I was lucky," Jasmine said, sitting straighter. "I had a friend who made me go back, who drove me to a different hospital, who didn't take 'you're fine' as an answer." She took a breath, long and steady, then delivered the line like a verdict. "I came close to dying because a trained medical professional looked at my skin, my gender, and my calm voice, and decided I wasn't worth investigating." That hit harder than any insult. It echoed. She let the silence sit. Then finally she looked at Colbert with a gaze that didn't blink. "So when you ask if I believe racism exists in the system, what you're really asking is whether I trust what almost killed me." She leaned forward just enough to compress the space between them. "And when you turn that story into a question for ratings," she said, almost whispering, "you're not starting a dialogue. You're protecting a delusion." The crowd remained frozen. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to zoom in closer or back off entirely. Jasmine sat back, collected, composed, and utterly untouchable. She had walked straight into the teeth of the moment, and now they weren't sure who had bitten who. The air was already heavy. Jasmine had just made the studio face something they weren't prepared to see. Pain that didn't fit the punchline. But Colbert wasn't ready to give up control. His smile returned, this time smaller, tighter. He shuffled his cards again, but this time he wasn't looking down at them. He was watching her. "Okay," he said slowly, voice softer now, as if trying to guide the energy back into familiar territory. "Let's pivot a little. I want to ask you about someone you've shared a stage with recently. Senator Langford." The name alone shifted the room. He's, let's say, not exactly a moderate. The guy once called protesters domestic threats on live television. He's pushed legislation to limit press freedom and famously said America needs more prisons, not more programs. A lot of people would call him a symbol of the new far-right populist wave. And you, Colbert leaned back with a faux casual gesture. You were seen standing right next to him, smiling. That doesn't bother you? Being linked to that kind of extremism? The question was framed to trap, not explore. It was a tactic. Take a controversial figure, attach her to him by proximity, and watch her squirm. The crowd murmured, some leaning in, others crossing their arms. Everyone was waiting to see if she'd deny, distance, or fold. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't lean forward or back. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in calculation. Her body didn't move, but her presence did. The temperature shifted again. She replied slowly, "Stephen, are we really talking about Senator Langford right now?" The way she said it stopped the room cold. There was no sarcasm, no defensiveness, just clarity. "Or are you bringing him up?" she continued, voice steady as a steel beam. "Because it's easier to talk about him than to talk about Senator Whitmore?" That name dropped like glass on concrete. The room hushed instantly. A few nervous laughs tried to escape, but they died in people's throats. Colbert blinked. For the first time tonight, he didn't have a comeback ready. Jasmine didn't wait for permission to continue. "It's interesting, Stephen. Every time someone like me raises questions about who holds power, real power, someone like you brings up the loudest voice on the fringe. A decoy, a distraction." Her tone was calm, but her words burned. "Langford says wild things on TV. He's easy to mock, easy to point at and say, 'That's the problem.'" She shifted in her seat for the first time, subtle but deliberate. "But you and I both know he's not the one crafting the policy behind closed doors. He's not the one signing off on surveillance budgets. He's not the one meeting quietly with defense contractors while communities like mine can't get clean water." Colbert's smile faded entirely now. He sat perfectly still. "But Senator Whitmore," Jasmine said, her voice cooling to something sharper, "she's not loud. She's not chaotic. She doesn't go viral for shouting. She gets praised for being measured, for being reasonable. Meanwhile, she votes to expand federal police powers. She sits on corporate boards that profit from private detention centers. She's passed laws that put thousands of young black men behind bars for nonviolent offenses, while giving speeches about unity." The room was dead quiet. Colbert tried to shift in his seat, but he couldn't find the right rhythm. The energy had left his hands. It was in hers now. "So you want to ask me why I was seen near someone controversial?" Jasmine asked. "Fine, ask it. But let's also ask why no one on this stage, no one in this room, has asked Whitmore about the power she holds right now." She leaned forward, just a little, just enough. "Why is it that when I stand next to someone, it's a scandal, but when she signs a bill that devastates an entire community, it's called policy?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "That's the game, Stephen. I know it. You know it. Distract people with outrage over association, so they don't look too closely at the ones who smile while doing damage quietly." The audience said nothing. Even the cameramen were still. Colbert opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time that night, his timing was gone. And for the first time that night, Jasmine wasn't defending herself. She was defending truth. The silence between them stretched, but Jasmine didn't rush to fill it. Instead, she moved with calm precision, reaching down beside her chair and lifting a slim, dark leather folder onto her lap. It made no sound, but its presence landed like a declaration. She didn't fumble. She didn't hesitate. With practiced fingers, she unzipped the folder and flipped it open, revealing a crisp stack of printed documents. Charts, bar graphs, raw figures, and footnotes with real names, real years, and real suffering. The studio lights caught the slight reflection off the glossy paper, making them shimmer in front of the audience like evidence presented under oath. For the first time that evening, Jasmine wasn't just answering, she was prosecuting. "You want to talk about values?" she said softly, not looking up yet. "You want to talk about credibility? About who really stands on principle?" She lifted the top page and held it up, not to Colbert, but to the camera. A bar graph, stark red lines. No need for dramatic fonts. The numbers told their own story. This chart tracks the loss of health insurance coverage in working-class districts from 2017 to 2023, particularly in states where federal subsidies were slashed under the so-called streamlining efforts. You personally applauded on this very show. Colbert didn't respond immediately. His expression was neutral, measured, but his body shifted in the chair, just slightly. A tell. She continued, voice steady and factual. Do you remember what you said? I do. You joked that maybe if folks have to pay more out of pocket, they'll stop going to the ER for stubbed toes. That's a quote from you. November 14th, 2019. A few murmurs stirred through the audience. They weren't laughing now. Jasmine flipped to the second sheet. This one had colored overlays across a U.S. map. These are the counties where those policies hit hardest. Places where thousands lost access to essential care. Not luxury, essential care, chemotherapy, diabetes treatment, prenatal screenings. Gone. She laid that sheet down, carefully aligned with the first. Then she picked up the third, a line graph trending sharply upward. Medical bankruptcies. You made a segment about healthcare bureaucracy and called it government bloat. The same year, personal bankruptcies from medical debt jumped 23% in underinsured populations. That's not bloat, Stephen. That's blood. The silence in the room shifted, no longer awkward, now heavy, weighted with realization. Jasmine looked out, not just at Colbert, but beyond him, beyond the cameras. Do you know what it's like to sit across from a single mother who has to choose between insulin for her child and rent? And then watch her blamed for poor decision-making on national television by people who've never had to choose between survival and shame. No one in the room moved. Not the audience, not the crew, not Colbert. I represent people who were already holding on by a thread, she said, lowering the documents now and stacking them calmly. And when the policies you celebrated sliced through that thread, it wasn't abstract. It was immediate. It was brutal. And it was deadly. The lights didn't dim, but somehow the stage felt darker. Jasmine's voice didn't shake. She wasn't emotional in the way people expected. No fury, no raised pitch. Just the weight of someone carrying more names in her memory than most people carry in their contacts. You didn't lose coverage, Stephen. Your premiums didn't spike. Your child didn't sit in a free clinic hallway for 6 hours with a ruptured appendix because the urgent care centers had shut down. But mine did. My district did. And you turned that into late-night content. The audience was frozen. A few heads bowed slightly. A middle-aged woman in the second row blinked rapidly. A man in a sports coat rubbed his knuckles together, visibly unsettled. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, eyes still locked on her host. You want to talk about ethics? She asked, barely above a whisper. This is what your kind of ethics created. She didn't point. She didn't raise a finger. She didn't need to. The papers on the desk, silent, clinical, undeniable, spoke louder than applause ever could. The silence around the documents still hung in the air, thick as velvet. Jasmine's voice had landed like a final note in a courtroom, but Colbert wasn't ready to concede. His show wasn't built for silence. He leaned forward slightly, hands now clasped together, and adopted the careful tone of someone stepping into sensitive terrain while still aiming to land a punch. Okay, he said, his voice lowered, thoughtful, but lined with a rehearsed edge. You've made your point. But some people watching tonight might say, wait a second, didn't Congresswoman Crockett once defend the police using data that didn't tell the whole story? He glanced at his notes, casually flipping a card. There was that time, 2 years ago, you cited a drop in arrest rates as evidence of improved community trust. But what about the fact that the same district saw a spike in unreported crime? Critics called it misleading, cherry-picked, designed to make law enforcement look good. He said it with his trademark lightness, but there was weight behind the words, the kind meant to shake public trust, to frame her as a contradiction. The crowd reacted on cue, a few nods, soft murmurs, a ripple of shifting in seats. It was the kind of accusation that didn't need to be proven. It just needed to be planted. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't shake her head or interrupt. Instead, she slowly reached into the side of her folder, pulled out a slim black remote, and pressed a button beneath the desk. Behind them, the studio's massive wall screen flickered to life. No sound at first, just the unmistakable frozen frame of the Late Show from 3 years earlier. Colbert at his desk, eyes wide, mid-joke. The video rolled. There he was, laughing as he delivered a bit about a man in Cleveland mistaken for a robbery suspect. Tall, hoodie, and suspicious of mayonnaise, Colbert had joked as the audience roared in the clip. And by suspicious, I mean black. The line hit. It had hit then too. Drawn laughs, applause, a confident pivot into a quip about suburban paranoia and 911 overuse. But in the silence of tonight's studio, the joke didn't land. It recoiled. The clip ended, and the screen went black. Jasmine looked at Colbert. Her voice was even. Sharp. You want to question how I use numbers? Fine. But let's also question what you've used for laughter. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Because that wasn't satire, she said. That was a real arrest. A real man on his knees in front of his kids, handcuffed for looking like someone else. He was innocent, and you made it a segment. The audience sat motionless. The silence wasn't polite, it was stricken. You talk about misleading context, Jasmine continued. But what context is there, Stephen, when a joke turns someone's trauma into your studio's applause line? Her gaze didn't soften. Her shoulders didn't drop. I didn't come here to win a debate, she said, but I won't sit still while you throw around the word manipulation from behind a desk that's polished with the pain of people like me. Colbert's face remained neutral, but his eyes had lost their smirk. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice no longer cutting, but cold, surgical. Saying something cruel with a smile doesn't make it satire. It just makes it more comfortable for people to ignore what's actually broken. She paused, letting the words settle into every uncomfortable corner of the room. Let me be very clear, she said finally. I stand by my data because it came from communities. Yours came from a punchline. She sat back, and the studio for once didn't know who to look at. The host, cornered in his own arena, or the woman who had just turned his show into a courtroom and made the jury stare at their own complicity. The weight of the previous exchange hadn't lifted. It had thickened. The audience wasn't leaning forward anymore. They were pinned to their seats. Colbert had lost the rhythm, and he knew it. The air held that distinct pressure, the kind you feel in a courtroom before a verdict, in a hospital waiting room before the news. Jasmine could have stopped. She had already drawn blood with truth, exposed the polished cruelty that hides behind satire. But she wasn't done, because facts alone don't move a nation, voices do. Her hands moved slowly. No dramatics, no flair. Just deliberate motion, like she was opening a wound that demanded to be seen. From the inner flap of her folder, she drew out a small voice recorder, plain, white, clinical. She held it for a moment in her palm, as if feeling the weight of the life stored inside it. Then she set it gently on the desk between them. It was a line in the sand, and Colbert instinctively leaned back. I brought something you don't have, she said quietly, her voice lower than before, but infinitely more dangerous. Not a joke, not a clip, not applause. I brought a truth that didn't survive your headlines. She clicked play. The studio lights seemed to dim on their own, or maybe it was just the shift in the room's oxygen. A woman's voice came through, raw, trembling, layered with heartbreak that had no time to heal. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't staged, it was real, too real. They told me he was faking, the voice began, not crying, not shouting, just surviving. My son, I said he was struggling to breathe. They said he was overreacting, said he was calm, that he didn't look like someone dying. The voice broke slightly. The audio hissed faintly. The silence in the studio became absolute. I asked them to move. They wouldn't. By the time the EMT checked his pulse, his lips were blue. They still told me he just needed rest. He died 37 minutes later. A choked breath came through the speaker. Then nothing. The clip ended, but the room didn't restart. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence wasn't empty. It was a scream, choked in the throats of hundreds. Jasmine didn't look at the camera. She didn't look at Colbert. Her eyes stayed fixed on the recorder. She was a mother from Detroit, she said softly, Her son's name was Marcus, 17, black, honors student, asthmatic. He died in a hallway because his pain wasn't considered urgent enough by a system built not to see him. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She called me after the funeral, said no one believed her. Not the doctors, not the press, not even the social worker who filed the death report. But I did. She turned slowly toward Colbert now, her expression unreadable, her words carved from something ancient and bitter. You talk about facts, Stephen, about data, about principles, but I carry names. I carry recordings. I carry the voices your audience doesn't hear because they aren't entertaining enough to make it into a monologue. The silence was now suffocating. You think the show is about politics? I'm not here for politics. I'm here for the ones who never made it on time. She gestured toward the recorder, small still, but heavy enough to bend the studio in half. This, she said, is the sound of what you've never had to live through. And until you do, maybe ask fewer questions about who's too angry and more about why we're still mourning. Her voice didn't crack, but 1,000 hearts in that room just did. And for the first time all night, not even the cameras dared move. The last words of the mother's recording still echoed in the minds of everyone in the room, long after the audio itself had gone silent. It wasn't just the sound that haunted, it was the space left behind, the empty ache between syllables, the unmistakable truth that no monologue, no commercial break, no clever pivot could erase what had just been laid bare on national television. For the first time all night, the power didn't belong to the host. It belonged to the woman who had dared to bring grief into a space designed for applause. Colbert shifted in his chair, subtly at first, then more noticeably as he cleared his throat, eyes darting toward the stage manager just off camera. The glow of the cue monitor blinked quietly, the red light urging him to rap. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his stack of cards, now useless. And when he finally spoke, the strength that usually wrapped his voice was missing. Well, he muttered, forcing a laugh so light it vanished the moment it touched the air. This has been intense, important no doubt, but, we're actually out of time. He trailed off. Even the apology wasn't complete. The words were an escape rope he wasn't sure would hold. And in that moment, he realized the audience wasn't coming with him. They weren't laughing. They weren't nodding. They weren't ready to move on. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't sigh. She simply watched him, calm, composed, unshaken. Then she turned her head slowly toward the audience, and that's when she smiled. It wasn't smug. It wasn't triumphant. It was precise. The kind of smile born not of victory, but of certainty. A woman who had been dismissed 1,000 times and still found her voice intact. A woman who understood that sometimes the truth doesn't need a microphone. It just needs someone who refuses to be interrupted. Her tone was quiet but unwavering. I think your audience, she said, letting her words settle like a weight on the studio floor, can give 2 more minutes to something more real than applause. No one moved. Not the host. Not the cameras. Not the carefully stage-managed world that had, until that very moment, believed it was in control. Even the blinking red light on the cue monitor seemed to hesitate. Jasmine leaned back slightly in her seat, hands still folded, not begging, not asking, simply continuing. The authority in her voice didn't come from volume. It came from presence, from experience, from loss. And as the seconds stretched into something more profound, it became painfully clear that for the first time all night, Colbert couldn't end the show, because the show wasn't his anymore. Not while truth was still speaking. The stillness in the studio had shifted from shock to something closer to reverence. The energy didn't belong to the show anymore. It belonged to the truth hanging between them, in the air, in the weight of what had already been said. Jasmine let that silence stretch just long enough to become sacred. And then, with a breath barely audible, she reached back into her folder for something heavier than a quote or a quip. She pulled out 3 stapled pages, bland, bureaucratic, yet terrifying. The kind of government document that never makes headlines but decides who suffers. The kind of data that lives in footnotes while people live with the consequences. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the paper. You want to know what real imbalance looks like? She asked, her tone flat but piercing. It's not just about who gets airtime or whose voice is loudest. It's about who gets funded and who gets forgotten. She unfolded the first page, exposing it to the camera without theatrics. Just the bare truth. Her finger tapped the top line. This is a line-by-line reduction in federal public benefit spending between 2016 and 2023. It's all here. Housing assistance, down 31.2%, SNAP reductions affecting 1.6 million households, emergency Medicaid waivers, revoked in 19 states during the peak of a respiratory pandemic. She flipped to the second page, her voice tightening, not with anger, but with precision, with lived experience. Meanwhile, here's what went up during the same period. Federal and state subsidies for high-budget entertainment projects, TV shows, streaming giants, film festivals, PR contracts for government messaging. In one fiscal year, the Department of Commerce approved $84 million for domestic media partnerships, while cutting youth nutrition grants in 2/3 of inner-city districts. She laid the papers flat across the desk now, perfectly aligned, like evidence before a jury. And in a way they were. She turned to Colbert, expression unreadable, gaze sharp. You talk about politics like it's performance, like dysfunction is just another comedy genre. But this isn't satire, Stephen. This is suffering measured in decimal points. Her voice dropped an octave. While you joke about who won the week, I come from places where people pray not to lose their heat, where schools no longer serve lunch on Fridays and landlords turn off water without warning, where the mail doesn't bring relief, it brings denial letters. And when it does, the comedians are silent. The studio, which once fed off rhythm and repartee, had become a courtroom of conscience. I'm not here to entertain. I'm here to remind you that behind every punchline about Congress, there's a woman who didn't get her insulin this month, a child whose coat is a pillow, a father who hides the eviction notice until the lights go out. She paused. Let that land, then held up the final page, blank except for one line circled in red ink. Unspent emergency funds reclassified for media development. She stared at it a moment. Do you know what that means, Stephen? She asked, quieter now. It means money meant to help people survive was rerouted to help people look good. She looked up again, directly into the camera. And while you mock the absurdity of it all, millions live in the punchline. She placed the pages down, neatly, precisely, and sat back. She hadn't raised her voice once, but the silence that followed could have cracked stone. The documents lay untouched, splayed across the desk like an indictment. But it wasn't just ink and numbers that had silenced the room. It was the way Jasmine had made the data personal, human, real. The kind of truth you couldn't edit with laughter. Around the studio, faces were frozen mid-expression. The clappers in the back row hadn't moved. The interns at the edge of the crowd had lowered their iPads. Somewhere in the third row, a young man, 20s, buzz-cut, denim jacket, turned slowly to look at the woman beside him. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were glossy, hands clasped tightly together. They didn't expect this. No one had. The audience had come for comedy. But this was something else entirely. Colbert shifted in his chair, not in control, but in search of footing. The silence should have been a cue, should have told him this was the moment to pause, to absorb, to listen. But instinct dies hard, especially for someone who built a career on spinning discomfort into claps. He offered the room a hollow chuckle, one that never touched his eyes, and leaned forward just enough to appear present without actually engaging. Well, he said softly, almost as if confessing rather than commenting. That's certainly interesting. The words dropped like a stone in still water. He smiled, but even that looked unsure. A smile drawn by muscle memory, not conviction. Not one person laughed, not even the usual diehards in the front row. And then Jasmine looked up. The air changed again. No, she said, her voice sharp but steady. It's not interesting. She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften her edge to make it palatable. This is reality, Stephen. Not a segment, not a setup, not some clever transition between commercial breaks. She straightened the papers in front of her, not because they needed it, but because she understood the power of restraint. Her poise was unnerving, precise, calm, and completely unafraid. What you just heard, that wasn't policy theory or partisan spin. That was someone's home, someone's child, someone's death certificate, paid for by indifference and printed on recycled platitudes. Her words fell like hammer strikes, methodical and spaced, each one making space for the next. You say it's interesting. I say it's an indictment. Colbert's smile didn't hold. It cracked slightly at the edges. Jasmine leaned forward, not aggressively, but deliberately. The energy in her voice cooled, that more than anything made the room tenser. She wasn't angry. She was resolute. I've sat in town halls where mothers pass around photos of sons who didn't come home. I've watched voters cry in parking lots because they missed the deadline for SNAP renewals. I've walked through school gymnasiums that double as shelters. That's the reality we carry. She paused, then looked him directly in the eye. But what do you carry? The question wasn't loud, but it was thunderous. You sit in a multi-million-dollar studio, surrounded by professionals paid to make your discomfort disappear in post-production. You write jokes about dysfunction, while families are rationing antibiotics in zip codes your advertisers don't even track. The crowd had stopped being an audience. They were now witnesses. And it was clear, many were unsure which side of the courtroom they were sitting on. You call this interesting? She asked again. This is not content. This is consequence. Another pause. Another silence. No one dared interrupt. Jasmine slowly reached for the final document and slid it into her folder. Quietly, deliberately. Then she folded her hands and returned her gaze to Colbert, not with malice, but with something colder, more permanent. This isn't about whether you agree with me, Stephen, she said. It's about whether you see the people you've spent years pretending to speak for. The sentence hit with finality, not fury. And in that moment, the bright lights of the studio didn't feel like showbiz. They felt like exposure. A young woman in the front row wiped under her eye. Another man crossed his arms, then uncrossed them. Somewhere near the back, someone whispered, "Damn." Jasmine sat still. She didn't need to say another word. Because sometimes the most devastating thing in a room built for laughter is someone who refuses to play along. The silence hadn't moved since her last sentence. Still heavy, still charged, still hovering just beneath the rafters like thunder that refused to roll. The lights on set felt sharper now, colder, no longer stage-friendly, but surgical. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were listening, and more terrifying than that, for Colbert they were feeling. Jasmine remained composed, eyes steady on her host, hands folded with the discipline of someone who had learned that even breathing too hard in rooms like this could be held against her. But she wasn't finished, and she never raised her voice, not because she couldn't, but because the truth didn't need volume when it had weight. She leaned forward just slightly, her gaze still locked on Colbert, not in aggression, but in precision. "We don't have to agree," she said slowly, voice like glass under pressure. "But we do need fairness." The words were simple, uncomplicated. But in that room, they cracked like a gavel. Colbert swallowed, just once. He hadn't blinked in a while. His smile had long since collapsed into the kind of forced neutrality that looked like surrender behind the eyes. Jasmine continued. "And please," she said, her tone sharpening but never rising, "don't speak about freedom of speech. If your version of it means inviting people like me just to mock us." She didn't look at the audience, but the audience looked at her. Every eye, every breath. Something was happening now and they knew it. They weren't watching a guest anymore. They were witnessing someone unmask the very stage she sat on. "You don't get to hide behind satire," she added. "Not when the laughter is only allowed to point in one direction." There was no anger in her delivery, just undeniable clarity. The kind that couldn't be edited out in post. The kind that got replayed on the 6 o'clock news because it left the room changed. "This platform," she said, gesturing lightly to the studio around her, "was built on the idea that it could challenge power. But somewhere along the line, it stopped doing that and started shielding it instead." And then she finally turned to the crowd. Not to perform, but to confront. The camera followed her slowly, Panning across the faces now stripped of amusement, a young woman in a black beanie looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. A man in a blazer, previously smirking, now sat stone-faced, his jaw clenched, no longer sure if the person he came to cheer for was the person still holding the floor. No one laughed, not a sound. The camera drifted past them like it was searching for something to hold on to, some sign of comic relief. But it found none, because Jasmine had just burned the laugh track out of the room. She spoke again, her voice softer now but not gentler. "You want real freedom of speech?" she asked, gaze still on the audience. "It's when you let someone finish a thought even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if it doesn't fit your applause line, even if it reminds you that justice is louder than jokes." Her words landed like stones on glass. Colbert shifted again, tried to lift his shoulders in a gesture of neutrality, but there was nowhere left to retreat. Not intellectually, not morally. Jasmine wasn't arguing anymore. She was revealing, and that was more dangerous than any counterpoint. "There's a difference," she said, turning back to him now, "between disagreement and dismissal. One invites truth, the other buries it." She looked down briefly at the documents on the table, then back up. "I've been dismissed my whole life, by teachers, by prosecutors, by pundits who thought silence meant consent. But I learned something. When you speak clearly in rooms where you're supposed to be invisible, they call it disruptive. When you bring truth into comedy, they call it killing the vibe. But the only thing I've ever tried to kill is indifference." That sentence cut the air into fragments. And just like that, the studio felt like a courtroom again. One where the judge wasn't behind the desk, but across from it. One where the verdict wasn't spoken but felt. The camera lights dimmed, but the air in the studio didn't shift. It hung, charged and motionless, as if the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. Colbert managed to mutter something clipped and professional about an important discussion and thanked Jasmine for joining us. But it was clear to everyone watching he wasn't closing the show. She had already done that, with truth, with weight, with a finality that couldn't be followed by credits or jazz band riffs. The moment wasn't over. It was transferring, because in the seconds after the stage lights cooled and the applause sign blinked weakly overhead, the real battle, the one Colbert couldn't control, moved online. And it moved fast. Within minutes, the first clip hit Twitter, a 72-second segment from the second half of the interview, raw and unedited. Jasmine sitting straight-backed, eyes locked, voice steel-cut and low. "We don't have to agree, but don't speak about freedom of speech when your platform is built to humiliate the voices you invite." The caption read, "Crockett crushes Colbert." Finally, someone says it to his face. It took exactly 11 minutes to hit 10,000 retweets. By the half-hour mark, where Crockett crushes Colbert was trending #1 nationally, then globally. Twitter's servers slowed under the weight of simultaneous uploads from different angles. Some shot illegally from inside the studio by stunned audience members, others screen captured from bootleg streams, edited in real time with bullet points and fire emojis. And then came TikTok, not with noise but with silence. The most viral clip was just 14 seconds long. No background music, no fast edits, just Jasmine's voice, calm and deliberate, beneath a dim studio light. Truth doesn't have to yell. It just has to be brave enough to speak when the whole room wants silence. The caption below read simply, "She didn't flinch." Not once. The video exploded. 3 million views in under an hour. Duets, reactions, overlays of quiet tears from nurses, teachers, exhausted young mothers, watching on grainy screens from break rooms and hospital cafeterias. In Cleveland, a high school teacher played it for her civics class the next morning and watched in stunned silence as a group of normally disengaged seniors sat forward, eyebrows furrowed, no one speaking. A student finally whispered, "Why did that feel like she was talking to us?" In Houston, an Uber driver turned down his music, played the audio from the clip again, and said to his passenger, "That's the first time I've heard someone tell the truth on a comedy show." The wave wasn't partisan, it was personal. And then came CNN. The segment aired under the headline, "Crockett's combative interview sparks online firestorm." The framing was textbook. Faux neutral language laced with faint disapproval, snippets of the interview cut and re-edited out of order, followed by a panel of commentators, none of whom had been in the room, analyzing whether Jasmine's tone had been too confrontational for late-night civility. What they didn't expect was the backlash. The clip was uploaded to YouTube and ratioed into oblivion within hours. Tens of thousands of comments, most furious, some heartbroken, all laser-focused on a singular betrayal. That a woman had spoken with honesty and composure, and the media had treated her like a disruptor instead of a truth-teller. One of the most upvoted comments read, "CNN's problem isn't that they don't know what the truth is, it's that they're scared of what happens when someone tells it too clearly." And it didn't stop there. By the end of the first night, major liberal and conservative news outlets were covering it, each trying to spin it, own it, soften it, disarm it. But they couldn't, because Jasmine's words weren't just commentary, they were evidence. Clips of her exposing public benefit cuts versus entertainment subsidies were being broken down in TikTok explainers by former IRS agents. Healthcare activists were overlaying her statements about emergency room neglect with actual ER footage. Organizers in Chicago, Oakland, and Jackson were quoting her in flyers and live streams. "You don't get to talk about satire while we're burying our kids." And somewhere behind the scenes, producers at The Late Show were panicking. Emails were flying. Damage control was being drafted. Meetings were called to discuss whether to upload the full segment or a sanitized version, edited, restructured, softened with music and less of the audience silence. But the damage wasn't the segment. The damage was the absence of defense. Colbert hadn't lost a debate. He had lost the room, and the internet had seen it. The New York Times wrote an op-ed the following day. "When the audience stops laughing, what happens when late night meets real pain?" The author called the moment a rupture, noting that Crockett didn't hijack the interview. She reclaimed the stage from satire's safety net and forced everyone watching to ask whether comedy had become a weapon of deflection rather than reflection. Colbert's official account posted a brief, vague tweet that evening. "Appreciate all perspectives shared on last night's show. Always room for important dialogue." The replies were brutal. "You invited her to mock her, and she walked in holding a mirror. Say her name or say you weren't ready. Dialogue requires equal footing. You gave her a trap. She gave you the truth." Meanwhile, Jasmine had said nothing. No press releases, no threads, no retweets. She didn't need to. The silence was hers now. Because when a woman walks into a room designed to break her and instead exposes the foundation itself, she doesn't need to scream. She just needs the world to hear what she already knows. And on that night, they did. For the first time in a long time, they really did. If Twitter had lit the match and TikTok fueled the fire, academia, slow, measured, deliberate, was now watching the blaze with awe. And for once, it didn't try to contain it. In the days that followed the viral explosion, something unprecedented happened behind the doors of media schools from NYU to Berkeley. Professors rewrote their syllabi in real time. The headlines hadn't even cooled yet, but Jasmine's confrontation with Colbert was already being dissected in media ethics courses, political communication labs, and advanced journalism seminars. Not as a scandal, not as an outburst, but as a masterclass, a moment so precisely constructed, so flawlessly executed, that instructors couldn't ignore it. They weren't just analyzing what she said, they were studying how she said it, and more importantly, how it landed. The emotional current that had electrified living rooms and timelines now hummed under projectors and across classroom debates. Jasmine's voice echoed from speakers clipped to whiteboards. Truth doesn't have to yell. It just has to be brave enough to speak when the whole room wants silence. It played not as a soundbite, but as a lesson, a strategy, a turning point. At Columbia Journalism School, Professor Elaine Morris paused the clip mid-sentence and turned to her first-year cohort. "What do you see here?" she asked, not what they thought, but what they saw. A hand rose, then another, and another. "She timed it like a courtroom closing," said one student. "She didn't attack. She reframed," said another. She baited the host into revealing his bias, said a third, quieter voice near the window. No, Morris corrected gently. He revealed it himself. She just left the silence long enough for everyone to notice. In the back of the room, a visiting journalist from The Guardian scribbled furiously. The board read in large red chalk. When comedy forgets its conscience, this is how you take the mic back. And this was happening everywhere. At Northwestern, the Media Impact course opened its Thursday module with the title, Episode Crockett vs. Colbert, The Power of Prepared Truth. They analyzed her body language, her tone, the way she waited for laughter to die before landing her heaviest lines. They watched how she never raised her voice, never interrupted, never reached for applause, because she wasn't speaking to the audience in the room, she was speaking to the one outside it. And for the first time in years, classrooms were buzzing not about how to go viral, but how to hold the line when the spotlight tries to burn through you. It wasn't just communication students. Law schools began borrowing the segment as an example of applied argumentation in hostile environments. Rhetoric programs compared it to historical turning points in televised confrontation. Bobby Kennedy in Mississippi, Anita Hill's testimony, Barack Obama's 2008 Philadelphia speech. Except this time, it wasn't a man. And it wasn't a monologue. It was battlefield dialogue. And it was prepared. That's what stunned the faculty most. The detail in her data, the control in her cadence, the precision in her pushback. Jasmine hadn't walked into the lion's den with charm or cleverness. She walked in armed with evidence and the courage to force laughter to listen. At USC's Annenberg School, Professor Devin Shaw clicked to a slide showing Jasmine's printed documents on the Colbert table. The chart was visible, so were the footnotes. She didn't just call out policy injustice, he said, circling the slide with a laser. She brought receipts, tangible, irrefutable, inconvenient facts, live on camera with no safety net. One student raised her hand. But how do you even prepare for something like that? That's not taught in a textbook. Professor Shaw nodded. No, it's not, because textbooks teach how to speak. She teaches why you speak. There was a pause in the room, and then he clicked to the next slide. This is how you change the media game, without shouting, without name-calling, and without permission. That line became a meme by midnight. In Boston, Emerson College hosted a student-led panel called Breaking the Format when guests rewrite the script. The auditorium was packed. On the panel, a senior broadcast major summarized it best. Jasmine didn't fight to win the crowd. She fought to force the mirror upright, even if it shattered everything around her. Across the country, professors were no longer asking students how to craft a segment or cut a viral clip. They were asking, what do you stand for when the host mocks you? What will you say when the crowd turns on you? Will you have your facts ready or just your feelings? And quietly but undeniably, a shift began in media pedagogy. The age of quippy sound bites and staged political jabs was cracking. And Jasmine's appearance wasn't just a glitch in the system, it was a recalibration, a warning to hosts who played God with their guests, a signal to viewers numbed by laughter that some truths couldn't be digested in punchlines, and a blueprint to students who once believed justice could only be served behind podiums or in protests. Now they had proof it could also be delivered on late-night television, if you were ready and unafraid to speak while the whole room wanted you quiet. From classrooms where students once studied theory, Jasmine had become the case study. But the moment her name appeared on the crimson banner behind a Harvard lectern, it was no longer just analysis, it was recognition. Not of celebrity, but of clarity, of a voice that refused to shrink under ridicule or bow to performance. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, guest speaker, Kennedy School Forum, Equity in Media, and the Anatomy of Honest Dialogue. The line outside the hall snaked through the courtyard, past the brick arches, packed with journalism majors, political science students, and professors who hadn't seen their lecture halls this full in years. Inside, the air felt less like an academic event and more like the eve of something seismic. Jasmine didn't enter to applause. She entered to a quiet hum of anticipation, students sitting forward, pens already in hand. No teleprompter, no intro video. Just a woman who had held her ground against a juggernaut and left the nation speechless. She stood at the podium in black, understated but commanding, with the quiet confidence of someone who had already weathered the storm and knew she didn't need the wind to speak. "Let's begin with a simple premise," she said, her voice steady and direct. "The truth doesn't perform, it persists. No theatrics, no grand gestures, just measured, piercing cadence that cut through the politeness of the Ivy League chamber like a scalpel." She didn't recount the Colbert night as a victory. She dissected it as an ecosystem. How media trains the public to laugh before it thinks. How narratives are shaped by who's holding the mic and who they believe deserves to speak into it. How a woman of color is often invited not to dialogue, but to decorate the illusion of balance. "The stage was never neutral," she said flatly, "but neither am I." Heads turned, pens paused. That line would be quoted in op-eds, student blogs, and Twitter threads for weeks. She moved seamlessly between policy and narrative warfare, explaining how media framing could silence victims more efficiently than any law. She showed charts of speaking time disparities, interrupted guests by race and gender, and the subtle mechanics of laugh tracks as weapons. But more than data, she delivered challenge. "Ask yourselves," she said, her eyes scanning the audience, "who do we protect with satire, and who do we permit ourselves to mock?" The applause wasn't thunderous. It was slow, rising, thoughtful, because what she gave them wasn't entertainment. It was accountability. Later that week, she appeared on a national talk show, a glossy, polished evening segment hosted by a seasoned anchor known more for celebrity interviews than anything resembling confrontation. The topic was her Harvard lecture. The host leaned forward, clearly hoping for a juicy retelling of the Colbert encounter. "What did that night feel like for you?" he asked with a rehearsed smile. "I mean, sitting across from him, with all that tension in the room, what was going through your mind?" Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't play coy. She didn't deflect. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her hands folded in her lap like she wasn't here to defend herself, only to state what needed to be said. "I wasn't there to win an argument," she said softly, but with unmistakable firmness. "I came to make people ask themselves, what exactly are you laughing at? And why?" The host blinked. The smile froze just a half second too long. She continued, letting the silence stretch like a stage. "Because when a woman talks about racial bias in healthcare, and the room chuckles, that's not about her. That's about us. That's about what we've normalized, what we've decided is safe to mock." The camera didn't cut away. The producers didn't insert a graphic. The moment was raw, and they knew it. Jasmine leaned forward now, voice steady as ever. "Civility doesn't mean silence. Dialogue doesn't mean deference. And freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequence, especially if your job is to shape public opinion and you're doing it through laughter." Across living rooms and dorm rooms and newsroom break rooms, that clip would replay like a confession wrung out from a system that had gotten too comfortable ridiculing the inconvenient. On social media, it sparked headlines, not just a clapback. Crockett's Harvard lecture redefines media accountability. Truth doesn't perform, the soundbite that shook two coasts. Crockett calls the game, and the game can't laugh it off. But Jasmine didn't revel in any of it. She hadn't come for the applause. She had come to recalibrate what a public conversation could be, one where honesty wasn't edited for comfort and dignity wasn't sacrificed for ratings. And in doing so, she didn't just shift a narrative, she shifted the lens. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.